Every week, I think I have an idea, and then news happens, and it all gets chucked, and I have to start over. First, let me ask a quick question. How many here watch Rachel Maddow on a Monday night? How many here absolutely giggled at the thought that Hillary Clinton was in the green room as the news was coming down, and somebody had to go back there and say, "Hold on, we have to bump you"? Whoever that person was is going to have a story to tell for generations at Christmas and Thanksgiving. Oh, goodness. What does accountability look like? Merriam-Webster defines accountability as the quality or state of being accountable. Well, isn't that helpful? And then it says, especially an obligation or willingness to accept responsibility or to account for one's actions. Now that's more interesting. An obligation or a willingness to accept responsibility. Now there is being accountable, and then there is being held accountable, which is much more like what we are seeing in these past few months. My friend and colleague, Reverend Kristen Schmidt, which I have to say, her husband is Reverend Christian Schmidt, and I went to seminary with both of them, and they're just a delightful, delightful pair. Kristen observed in the aftermath of that awful insurrection violence that the healing and forgiveness and unity our nation so desperately needs will not come without repentance and accountability and a full reckoning of wrongs done. She also opined that accountability must involve an acknowledgement of harm done, of sins committed, and an understanding that one's actions were out of line. Now, it is difficult to achieve that sort of resolution when the person doing and leading and causing the harm feels entitled to be cruel. It is clear that the former occupant does not value the archaic rules of democracy or of our democratic republic. Those rules and words hold no more significance in his calculations than so many quaint words cross-stitched on a sampler to be judged at the county fair. So how do we hold such a character accountable for his actions? How do we hold his followers accountable for what they say and do? How do we hold anyone accountable to a system of values that they reject outright? Reverend Kristen Schmidt identifies as a key component of accountability the requirement that the offending parties come to acknowledge the harm they have caused. Even if they do not see their behavior as wrong, accountability requires them to understand that it is judged as wrong by the rules of the society in which we live. You may not like the rules, but they are still the rules. You may take glee in being cruel to others, but that does not mean that behavior is acceptable to the rest of us. Yes, you may think that this or that particular kind of person is somehow less than human and therefore undeserving of humane treatment from you, but understand this: there are rules against violence in our society. And just because you and your friends feel something is justified does not make it so. Accountability requires a certain degree of spiritual maturity. And that spiritual maturity requires a certain degree of humility. Humility is what allows us to consider that our point of view might not be the only valid perspective in existence. We must be willing to entertain the notion that we could possibly be wrong. Unitarian Universalists struggle with the idea of accountability and resolution. I mean, we like to say the words, we like to think we are okay with them, but our faith calls us to a covenantal relationship, and we sort of don't know how to get back to that after there has been transgression, redress, that's a word, right? Yes, redress and resolution. How do we get back to relationship? We don't have a theology that for forgiveness. We don't have a theology for forgiveness and redemption in this world. Like traditional universalism holds that all people are reconciled with God when they die. There are two kinds of universalists. There's ultra-universalists who believe that reconciliation is immediate. You die, bing, you're upstairs. Restorationist universalists believe that everyone gets reconciled to God eventually, but that some have to stay sort of in the waiting room for a while until they are restored to a state of grace and allowed into heaven. If they're really bad, that might wait till the very, 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 very last day. But even the worst, most monstrous people eventually get in to heaven. But the nature of their crimes in their lifetime will determine how long they spend on the steps. But what happens while those folks are alive? If we have a person in our community who commits a crime, what happens? They go to court, perhaps maybe are found guilty and made to atone for their actions in some way. Now, this is a very transactional approach to morality. It is about enforcement and compliance and is couched in transactional terms. A person must pay for their crimes. After their punishment is completed, they are said to have paid their debt to society. But then what? Are they able to return home and fully integrate back into society? In theory, they kind of should. Like, it looks like that on paper. But can they go back to their old job? No. Can they go home to live with a family? Depends. Can they start over with a clean slate, like the debt was paid after all, and move on? As a culture, and I would say we as Unitarian Universalists are complicit in this, we assign a scarlet letter to those who offend the laws or society's expectations. Sure, they paid their debt, but can we ever embrace them as whole people again? Can we invite them to our homes for dinner? Do we ask them to volunteer in our organizations or serve on our boards? They were convicted of a felony. In many states, they are no longer allowed to vote in any elections, state, local, federal. If their crime was of a violent or sexual nature, they must forever let police know their whereabouts. And in some cases, police will engage in a campaign to notify the community that a sex offender has moved into the area. I cannot imagine that it is an easy transition back from prison to that sort of reception. They carry with them the burden of their guilt, like so many others carry with us the burden of our student loan debt. It is a thing that restricts where they go and what they can do, and it may well last the rest of their lives. That is a system rigged to fail. But I digress. We can talk about forgiveness and the penal system and all of that another time. See, accountability is so complex. Society requires one sort of accountability. People require a different sort of accountability. Now, I cannot imagine that there are folks who wake up one day and decide to hate anything and everything that is not like them. Right? Just wake up one day and say, I'm mad at everything. Well, okay, like after coffee. Because there are days. But the wisdom of Rogers and Hammerstein told us in South Pacific that hate what? Must be carefully taught. Exactly. And as much fun as people like to make of some of those golden era, very corny Hollywood musicals, there are pockets of uncomfortable truth contained therein. People are taught to hate those who are different from them. People are taught to feel threatened. An infant is born with two fears: fear of loud noises and the fear of falling. All other fears are given to them by us. So what can make a person believe that queer people or people of color or immigrants or liberals of one stripe or another are terrible people and not worthy of respect as human beings? What causes people to think that? In seminary, I took a class called Justice Matters. And in it, we studied how systems of power are used to create striations in humanity, truly a caste system or classes. Isabel Wilkerson wrote about it in her book, Caste. And what it boils down to is people with more power tend to know less about those who have less power in the system. And those who have less power know all kinds of things about those higher up the food chain. It makes sense. If your survival or your continued employment requires making somebody more powerful than you happy, then you learn what is required to do that. Those people do not rely on you for their survival-ish, but they probably know more about their managers or their administrators or their bosses. So the relative value placed on each level within the system creates a false sense of justification to treat the person with lesser power as having less human value than us. And when somebody from a particular spot on the ladder manages to assert themselves to claim a higher spot, well, those at the upper level tend to react like they've been invaded or attacked. Who do you think you are? You don't belong here. This place is for star-bellied sneetches, and you haven't got a star. Upheaval in a system of power causes convulsions of resistance. When we look at freedom and opportunity as finite resources, we can only imagine then that for someone else to get more, somebody's got to lose some, right? When you have a zero-sum game, that's what we think. And we don't want to share whatever it is we've got. We might not like it all that much, but we're damned if we're going to share it with somebody. Right? We will even do great harm to ourselves in order to not share our stuff. There was a book, I can't remember the name of it, but the woman, it might have been Isabel Wilkerson, it might have been Caste, talked about the post-war era. A lot of cities had municipal swimming pools, right? And that they were like the crown jewel of every town, man. Their kids could go swim. And then in the 1960s and beginning of the 70s, those pools were forced to integrate. And rather than share the pool with black kids, cities filled them in with dirt. And people who could afford to, mostly white people, got a pool in their own backyard, or moved to the suburbs where they could put in a pool, or joined a pool club that was restricted to membership. But rather than share with somebody different, they were willing to cut off their own kids' access to pool. Now, right now, we've got in our society a segment or demographic that feels attacked on all sides. It feels denied wealth by corporate giants and industries, and they feel that their already tenuous grasp on what small amount of comfort they've got is at risk, is under attack from another group of people who appear to be very strange to them. Who are these young, queer, multicolored people with bright hair, strange tattoos and piercings, and demanding access to our spaces? Furries, they scream. Litter boxes in schools. I had a conversation about that last week with somebody. When you think that liberty or love is finite, and somebody else shares in that experience, you cannot imagine that somebody would have to lose to make that happen. And there's an interesting bit of brain chemistry that happens here. When someone is feeling attacked or threatened, their amygdala will not let them reason. This is why in the whole history of people being told to calm down, they have never calmed down, right? You need to calm down. That is not going to work. If somebody is frightened or traumatized and their thinking has resorted to their amygdala, there is no reason that can happen in that space. You have to get down out of the adrenaline rush in order to think clearly. Kristen Schmidt. It is only through real, sometimes very tough accountability that some people will understand that they've lost their way. Sometimes helping people find their way to truth, love, and justice means insisting that truth is truth, even if it isn't polite, even if it leads to argument. Truth is too important to set aside just because it challenges and upsets you. And I think this is, as progressives, tends to be where we have failed. We're not really comfortable stating absolutes, right? It just sort of makes us queasy. But we can say that violence at the Capitol on January 6th was wrong. We can say that all the corruption and graft and attempts to undo democratic process, all of that, we can say that that's wrong. We must hold accountable those who would see our nation crumble into a despotic nightmare. There are things that are true that others do not believe. The election was not stolen. There was no widespread fraud. Just because a person does not believe a truth does not mean it is not actually true. It means they are wrong. Right? There is no alternative history. There is wrong history. Now, they can choose to change or not, but there's really not much we can do about that. What we can do is support the systems that are going to hold everyone accountable for our actions. And grace, oh, grace, that's the bit at the end. Grace is the part of the equation that allows us to emotionally let go of the anger and let go of the hurt and of the desire for vengeance. Vengeance is not ours to manage, and anytime we try, it ends badly. Acknowledging when we are wrong is difficult. If it were easier, people would do it a lot more often. We are in a weird place this summer, politically, environmentally, democratically. We each have our own bits that we can do. Those trim tabs we talked about back in January. So my prayer is that we are able to have accountability, that we eventually see grace, and finally one day reach forgiveness.